Beyond the facade, my father's life before I knew him. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My father spent my entire life terrified of his own shadow, which is why the loaded Glock hidden under his floorboards made no sense. I was supposed to be looking for his premium life insurance policy. Just 24 hours ago, I got the phone call that shattered my aggressively mundane reality. A nurse from St. Jude's Memorial informed me that my father, Arthur, a retired actuary who considered jaywalking a mortal sin, was in the intensive care unit. The official police report called it a random, brutal mugging in an alleyway he had no business walking down. Detective Vance, the sharp-eyed local cop who handled the bloody scene, told me his wallet was gone and he'd taken a severe, calculated beating. So there I was, kneeling on the beige carpet of his meticulously organized suburban home office, trying to pry open the bottom drawer of his heavy mahogany desk. When the stubborn drawer jammed, I gave it a frustrated yank, snapping the cheap wood and exposing a hollow cavity hidden beneath the floorboards. It wasn't an accident. It was a custom-built compartment. Inside wasn't a stack of boring actuary tables or tax returns. It was a heavy, fireproof lockbox. I smashed the flimsy clasp with a brass paperweight. Inside sat a pristine, matte black Glock 19, a thick stack of $100 bills bound in rubber bands, and 3 different passports. I felt the air leave my lungs. How do you look at the man who raised you when you realize his real name might be a felony? My hands shook violently as I picked up the first passport. The little gold eagle on the front cover felt impossibly heavy, mocking me. I flipped it open, my eyes instantly darting to the photograph. It was my dad, all right. He looked a few years younger, his jaw set in a hard, unfamiliar line, completely devoid of the gentle, anxious smile he always wore. Arthur Pendleton, the man who taught me how to ride a bike with training wheels until I was 10, didn't exist in this little blue book. The face on the passport was his, but the name belonged to a stranger. Growing up, I was absolutely suffocated by Arthur Pendleton's relentless, crushing anxiety. I was the only kid in my neighborhood who wasn't allowed to have sleepovers, ride a skateboard, or join the local football team. The world is entirely too unpredictable, Sam. He would always tell me, meticulously locking our front door with 3 separate deadbolts every single night at exactly 8 o'clock. He drove 5 miles below the speed limit, checked the smoke detectors weekly, and wore a medical alert bracelet despite having no known allergies. He was, by all accounts, the most profoundly boring man on the face of the earth. I became a freelance photographer just to escape his rigid, colorless world, chasing adrenaline because he had denied me even a drop of it. Yet, as I sat on his office floor surrounded by the contents of the hidden lockbox, the profound irony of it all made my stomach violently churn. I picked up the second passport. The name printed on it was Marcus Thorne. The issue date was from 1996, roughly around the exact time my parents supposedly moved to this quiet suburb and had me. There were stamps from places my father swore he had never been: Colombia, Russia, the Cayman Islands. I picked up the heavy Glock, my fingers trembling against the cold steel. It wasn't dusty or neglected. It was freshly oiled and impeccably maintained, the tool of a man who fully expected to use it. Suddenly, the memory of his random mugging took on a deeply sinister new context. A man like Arthur doesn't get randomly mugged in an alleyway. A man named Marcus Thorne gets hunted down. I stared at the meticulously organized rows of financial ledgers on his bookshelf, suddenly wondering what other twisted secrets were hiding in plain sight within this house. I was holding terrifying proof that my entire childhood was nothing but an elaborate lie. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, the blue glow of my laptop illuminating the fake passports and the stacks of bound cash. I typed Marcus Thorne into every search engine and public records database I could access. At first, there was absolutely nothing. It was as if the man was a ghost. But then I adjusted the search parameters, filtering the dates back to the mid-1990s and scanning through digitized newspaper archives. What would you do if your midnight internet search turned your father into a ghost story? On page 4 of the search results, I found a scanned article from a major Chicago newspaper dated October 14, 1996. The headline made my blood run cold. Syndicate enforcer vanishes along with $4 million in diamond heist. The article detailed a brutal, highly coordinated robbery that left two rival cartel members dead and millions in untraceable assets missing. The police suspected an inside job, orchestrated by a shadowy enforcer known in the criminal underworld only as Marcus Thorne. According to the article, Thorne was a phantom, a man with no criminal record who handled the syndicate's messiest, most violent problems. The timeline was entirely undeniable. The heist occurred exactly 3 months before I was born, perfectly aligning with the date my parents suddenly arrived in our sleepy suburban town with enough cash to buy our house outright. My dad wasn't a retired actuary who loved birdwatching. He was a violent fugitive hiding in plain sight. I kept reading the grainy text, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The article mentioned 3 prime suspects, and one of them had vanished without a trace. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed with a sickly, sterile energy as I walked toward room 412. The smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol turned my stomach. I clutched the heavy canvas messenger bag against my side. Inside it were the passports, the cash, and a printout of the 1996 newspaper article. I needed answers, and I was going to force them out of him. When I pushed the heavy wooden door open, Arthur was lying flat in the hospital bed, hooked up to a symphony of beeping monitors. His face was a patchwork of purple bruises and white bandages. He looked incredibly frail, a pathetic old man broken by the world. For a fleeting second, I felt a massive surge of guilt. But then I remembered the loaded Glock under his floorboards. I pulled a plastic chair to the edge of his bed, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. The harsh noise stirred him. His eyelids fluttered open, glassy and unfocused at first. He looked at me, managing a weak, pathetic smile. "Sammy," he croaked, his voice raw. But as his vision cleared, his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't see the worried son he expected. He saw the cold, furious realization radiating from my face. I slowly pulled the blue passport bearing the name Marcus Thorne out of my bag and placed it on his blanket. The transformation was instant and terrifying. The frail, pathetic demeanor vanished entirely. His monitors spiked as he suddenly lurched forward, ignoring the pain. He grabbed my shirt collar and whispered that they were coming to finish the job. "Get your mother out of the house," Arthur hissed, his grip on my collar shockingly strong despite his injuries. "Do not go to the police. Do not trust anyone. They found me, Sam. You have to run." His voice lacked any trace of the gentle, anxious father I knew. This was the voice of Marcus Thorne, cold and commanding. I stumbled back, pulling myself out of his desperate grasp, and shoved the passport back into my bag. I told him I wasn't running anywhere until I had the whole truth. But before he could argue, a nurse walked into the room, instantly breaking the intense tension. I practically sprinted out of the hospital, my mind spiraling into total chaos. The suffocating reality of the situation was crushing me. I needed to get to Mom. I needed to know how much of this nightmare she was responsible for. As I burst through the double doors into the damp hospital parking lot, I was entirely consumed by my panic. I wasn't looking where I was going and slammed hard into the shoulder of an older man walking toward the entrance. "Excuse me," I muttered, keeping my head down. "No problem at all, son," the man replied. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried a faint, unplaceable accent. I glanced up. He was in his 60s, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in this suburban town. He was holding a small bouquet of cheap hospital gift shop flowers. He looked right at me and politely asked if I knew where he could find a patient named Marcus Thorne. The old man smiled warmly at me, but his eyes were completely dead and cold. I froze, the blood draining completely from my face. Every single survival instinct my father supposedly never taught me was screaming in my ears. I forced a blank, confused expression onto my face. "Marcus Thorne? Never heard of him. You probably want to check with the front desk." I lied, my voice remarkably steady. The man, who I would later come to know as Silas, tilted his head, studying my face for an agonizingly long second before nodding slowly. "Thank you. I'll do just that," he purred. I didn't look back as I power-walked to my car. I broke every speed limit getting to my parents' house. I found my mother, Helen, in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing a spotless countertop. She looked up, her sweet, anxious face masking decades of lies. "Sam, honey, how is your father?" The doctors won't tell me anything on the phone. I slammed the printout of the 1996 Chicago heist onto the counter right over her soapy sponge. "Who is Marcus Thorne, Mom?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. She stared at the paper, the color vanishing from her cheeks. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle, highly unconvincing sound. "I have absolutely no idea what this is, Sam. Have you been reading those silly conspiracy websites again?" She deflected, but she made a critical error. She reached out to move the paper, and her hands were shaking so violently she knocked over a heavy ceramic mug, shattering it across the floor. She tried to deny it, but her trembling hands gave away the decades of deception. "Stop lying to me," I shouted over the broken ceramic. Helen collapsed into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands. She wept silently, a pathetic, broken sound. "You weren't supposed to find out," she sobbed. "He gave up everything for us. He locked his entire past away." Before she could spiral further, I pulled a small, brass key out of my pocket. I had found it taped to the bottom of the lockbox under the floorboards. It had a faded tag attached to it with an address for a decrepit storage facility 2 towns over. I left my mother weeping in the kitchen and drove straight to the address. It was a run-down, rusting labyrinth of corrugated metal units bordered by a chain-link fence. The key fit perfectly into the rusted padlock of Unit 4B. I threw the heavy metal door upward, the screech echoing in the empty lot. I pulled a flashlight from my car and stepped into the suffocating darkness. The unit wasn't filled with stolen diamonds or stacks of cash. It was a shrine to a ghost. In the center sat a pristine, vintage 1970s Triumph motorcycle covered in a thin sheet of plastic. Next to it was a heavy wooden trunk. I popped the rusty latches. Inside, neatly folded, was a heavy, armored motorcycle jacket, an empty shoulder holster, and a stack of worn, leather-bound journals. I pulled the jacket out, holding it up to the pale light filtering in from the open door. The dusty leather jacket smelled like stale smoke, gunpowder, and a life I never knew. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages of the leather-bound journals. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's, meticulous, precise, and highly calculated. But the words belonged to a ruthless criminal. He chronicled the inner workings of the Chicago syndicate, detailing extortion rackets, bribes, and the planning of the 1996 diamond heist. But as I read through the entries leading up to the robbery, the narrative dramatically shifted. Arthur, or Marcus, wasn't the mastermind of the heist. He was just the muscle, the enforcer hired to protect the operation. The real architect of the robbery, the brilliant mind who mapped the security grids, bypassed the vault alarms, and ultimately betrayed the cartel to steal the $4 million for herself, was someone else entirely. I traced my finger over a specific entry dated 2 days after the heist. She double-crossed them all. If the cartel finds her, they will peel her skin off. I have the money. I have her. I have to create a new life for us before they realize what she did. I flipped to the front cover of the journal, searching for a name, a clue, anything. I found a faded Polaroid tucked into the binding. It was a picture of my mother, 20-something and fiercely beautiful, holding a massive, uncut diamond. My breath caught in my throat as the horrible truth finally clicked into place. The ruthless criminal mastermind they had been hunting all those years was actually my mother. I shoved the journals and the photograph into my bag, my mind reeling from the catastrophic revelation. My sweet, anxious mother, who baked cookies for the neighborhood block party and cried during life insurance commercials, was a former cartel thief. My father had spent his entire life playing the paranoid, suffocating protector because he was shielding the woman he loved from a gruesome execution. I drove back to my small apartment in the city, desperately needing a quiet place to process the absolute insanity my life had become. The sun was just starting to set, casting long, sinister shadows across the street. I unlocked my front door, tossed my keys onto the side table, and reached for the light switch. But I froze. The air inside my apartment felt wrong. It was too still, too heavy, and the faint scent of cheap hospital gift shop flowers lingered in the hallway. I slowly backed toward the door, my hand instinctively reaching for my pocket, though I had foolishly left the Glock back in the hidden floorboard. I flipped the light switch. The apartment had been methodically, ruthlessly tossed. Every drawer was emptied, every cushion slashed open, my camera equipment smashed to pieces on the hardwood floor. They were looking for the money. They were looking for the ledger. But that wasn't the worst part. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my eyes locking onto the center island. A single hollow-point bullet was sitting in the exact center of my kitchen table waiting. The bullet was a loud, undeniable message. We know exactly where you are, and you are entirely out of time. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to choke me. I couldn't go back to my parents' house. Silas was likely watching it. I couldn't go to the hospital. I needed help from someone outside this twisted family dynamic. I grabbed my messenger bag and bolted from the apartment, driving erratically through the dark streets until I reached the local police precinct. I asked for Detective Vance, the sharp-eyed cop who had originally investigated my father's mugging. She met me in a dimly lit interrogation room, looking exhausted and highly skeptical. "Sam, it's late. What's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms. I didn't have time for a gentle introduction. I pulled the blue passport and the faded Polaroid of my mother from the bag and slammed them onto the metal table. I told her everything. The hidden stash, the fake identity, the journals, and the man named Silas who had just destroyed my apartment. Vance stared at the evidence, her skepticism melting into profound, undeniable shock. She grabbed the passport and ran the name Marcus Thorne through her secure federal database terminal in the corner of the room. The screen flashed red with restricted access warnings. She turned back to me, her face completely drained of color. She locked the heavy precinct door and told me we were both in terrible danger. "Marcus Thorne isn't just a cold case," Detective Vance whispered, her eyes darting toward the locked door as if Silas might burst through it at any second. "He's a ghost the feds have been hunting for 3 decades. And if the cartel found him before the FBI did, your whole family is essentially dead." My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. It was Helen. "Sam," she sobbed hysterically. "He's gone. Your father discharged himself against medical advice. He took the car. He told me to pack a bag and hide in the basement." I cursed loudly and bolted from the precinct, Vance right on my heels. We drove to my parents' house with the sirens off, pulling into the driveway just as Arthur was walking out the front door. The transformation was absolutely chilling. The frail, battered actuary was completely gone. Despite his bruised face and taped ribs, he stood entirely upright, holding the matte black Glock 19 with a terrifying, practiced ease. He wore the dusty leather jacket from the storage unit. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of any parental warmth. This was Marcus Thorne. "Get out of here, Sam," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "I'm going to finish this tonight, alone." The frail old actuary was gone, replaced by a ruthless enforcer ready for a war. "You aren't doing this alone," I screamed, stepping directly into his path. "Silas came to my apartment, Dad. He left a bullet on my table. This involves all of us now." Arthur's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering dangerously in his cheek. He lowered the Glock slightly, the ruthless enforcer facade cracking just enough to reveal the desperate, terrified father beneath it. Detective Vance stepped out of the shadows, her badge clearly visible. "Arthur Pendleton, or whatever you call yourself, if you go out there alone, you will die, and your family will be next. We do this my way, or I arrest you right now." Arthur looked between me and the detective, realizing he had entirely run out of options. He pulled a cheap prepaid burner phone from his jacket pocket. "Silas called the house. He wants the ledger from the journals and the remaining cash. He demanded a meeting at the old Starlight Diner on Route 9 at midnight. He said if I don't show, he burns this house down with Helen inside." I looked at Vance. We had exactly 2 hours to turn a cartel execution into a police ambush. We formulated a desperate, highly dangerous plan right there in the driveway. I was going to be the bait. I took the burner phone from my father's trembling hand, took a deep breath, and hit redial. I dialed the burner phone and told the monster we were ready to make a deal. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner buzzed aggressively in the pouring rain. The parking lot was completely empty, save for a sleek, black town car idling near the dumpsters. I sat alone in a booth by the window, the canvas bag sitting heavy on the table in front of me. The diner was closed, the owner heavily compensated by Vance to leave the doors unlocked and disappear for the night. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The bell above the door chimed softly. Silas walked in, shaking the rain from his tailored charcoal suit. He slid into the booth across from me, a terrifyingly calm smile plastered on his face. "You're not Marcus," he noted, his dead eyes scanning the room. "My father is bleeding out in a basement." I lied smoothly, gripping the bag beneath the table. "I have the ledger. I have the location of the accounts. But you leave my mother alone." Silas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Your mother? You mean the little thief who slaughtered my brothers 30 years ago? Marcus didn't steal the diamonds, kid. He was just the love-struck idiot who took the fall to protect her." Silas reached inside his suit jacket, his smile vanishing entirely. "There is no deal. There is only a blood debt." Silas raised his weapon to fire just as the diner erupted in a blinding flash. Spotlights from 3 unmarked police cruisers flooded the diner through the rain-streaked windows, blinding Silas instantly. Detective Vance kicked the kitchen doors open, her service weapon drawn and leveled directly at his head. "Federal agents. Drop the weapon," she screamed over the sudden chaos. Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his dead eyes darting toward the exits, but he knew he was entirely outgunned. He slowly placed his weapon on the table and raised his hands, a bitter sneer twisting his face. The aftermath was a bureaucratic nightmare of epic proportions. Silas was taken into federal custody, facing a mountain of charges from decades of cartel activity. Because of the sheer value of the ledger we handed over, which dismantled 3 major organized crime families, and the fact that the statute of limitations on the original diamond heist had technically expired, Vance brokered a miraculous deal with the feds. Arthur and Helen were granted a heavily monitored form of immunity. They wouldn't go to prison, but they were placed on a permanent, restrictive watch list. I stood in their living room a week later, watching Arthur meticulously lock the front door with his 3 deadbolts. He looked old again, his shoulders slumped, the dangerous aura of Marcus Thorne entirely vanished. He had survived the nightmare, but the cost was astronomical. The law let him walk away, but our quiet suburban illusion was completely shattered forever. Things are different now. The suffocating tension that used to define our household has slowly evaporated, replaced by a strange, fragile honesty. Arthur no longer pretends to be terrified of the world. He admits that he was only ever terrified of losing us. Helen doesn't bake cookies for the neighborhood anymore. She spends her time painting in the sunroom, looking out the window with the quiet, reflective gaze of a woman who has lived multiple, dangerous lives. I finally moved out of the city and bought a small cabin near the mountains. I still take photographs, but I no longer chase adrenaline. I've seen enough real danger to last me a dozen lifetimes. I visit my parents every Sunday. We sit on the porch, drink cheap coffee, and never, ever talk about Chicago, the diamonds, or the man named Silas. We just exist in the quiet aftermath of a 30-year storm. Sometimes, I look at my father and try to see the ruthless enforcer who held a cartel at bay, but all I see is the man who taught me how to ride a bike. It's a profound realization that changes how you view the world. Identity is a fragile, messy thing, built on a foundation of necessary lies and desperate choices. You never truly know the people who sacrificed absolutely everything just to keep you alive.